Hello and welcome to this webinar, Rethinking the Earliest Stages of Construction, Closing the Gap Between Planning and Execution. This event is brought to you by Engineering News Record and sponsored by CMC. Hi, I'm Scott Seltz, publisher of ENR and your moderator for today's webinar, and thanks for joining us. Success in construction is often determined before the first wall goes up. This webinar explores how extending pre-construction collaboration into site prep and foundations can reduce work, speed schedules, and improve predictability, featuring expert strategies and real-world examples. Now let's get to know our presenters. Stephen Penny is Director of Transformation at CMC, where he's built a 21-year career spanning sales, operations, and leadership roles across multiple U.S. regions. In his current role, he helps advance innovation and efficiency within CMC's Rebar Fabrication Group, the company's core service for concrete reinforcement. Michael Trabucco is Vice President of Operations at Shirley Contracting Company, leading major infrastructure projects across Northern Virginia. With 20 years in bridge and structural construction, he's recognized for solving complex challenges and delivering value-driven solutions. An ENR Mid-Atlantic Top Young Professional in 2021, Mike also serves as Vice President on the board of Heavy Construction Contractors Association. Nick Cott is a Senior Vice President and Project Risk Broker with Aon, specializing in builders' risk replacement for large and complex projects across the U.S. and internationally. With nearly 2 decades of experience spanning brokerage, underwriting, and risk management, Nick has worked with ENR Top 500 contractors, Fortune 500 companies, and major real estate developers on projects often exceeding $1 billion in value. Now, I'll be rejoining our presenters at the end to field your questions that come in throughout the webinar, so don't forget to submit them in the Q&A section of your webinar console. And now I'll pass it over to Stephen Penny to kick it off. Stephen?
All right, thank you, Scott, and hello, everyone. It is a pleasure to be part of this conversation on rethinking the earliest stages of construction. So first off, I'm genuinely excited to dive into the topic of early stage construction. It's something I'm passionate about, and it means a big deal to all of us at CMC. It's also great to be joined in this conversation from 2 individuals with decades of experience in construction, as well as everybody tuning in today across the industry. So I want to say a big thank you to Mike and Nick for participating and sharing your insights from your many years of experience. So as we get started, I'm going to touch on 3 items that will help set the framework for our discussion today. First, I'll outline the traditional sequence of early stage construction and identify some of the existing gaps. Next, we'll highlight a costly example of when things go wrong. And then we'll revisit that early stage sequence and focus on some key items where there are opportunities to improve. So when we talk about early stage construction, we mean everything from planning and design through the moment foundations are poured. So on this visual, this shows a familiar sequence to all of us. This is where the focus of project preparation is on the planning, design, and pre-con areas. And even with this focus, still only 1 in 4 projects finish within 10% of the original deadline, and rework consumes up to 10% of total project costs. When we look at the entire timeline of this sequence, there are 2 key pivot point stages highlighted: the site prep and foundation works. This is where projects shift from ideas on paper to actual work in the ground. So this is where assumptions start to meet reality. We start uncovering things that are really underfoot, such as soil strength, drainage characteristics, utilities, access, and how well the design of the project actually fits those conditions. So then as foundation work begins, every decision about rebar layout, concrete sequencing, detailing for material submittals, they all connect back to that ground truth, what the real site and soil conditions are. And if these pieces don't line up, issues that could have been caught early become baked into the structure itself. We all know once rebar is tied and concrete's poured, flexibility disappears, and fixes that might have cost thousands can suddenly cost millions. So we call that the lock-in effect. So because these highlighted stages are the pivot points before lock-in occurs, they deserve the same level of focus, coordination, discipline, all the aspects that we bring to the planning and pre-con portions of the project. When we apply a coordinated and aligned mindset all the way through site prep and foundation, we can catch problems before they harden into the rework. And unfortunately, when that doesn't happen, when early stage assumptions go untested, then the consequences can be dramatic. So let's look at one project that proved that the hard way. So you all probably know this one if you're in the construction industry. This is the Ocean Tower at South Padre Island, or as often referred to, the Leaning Tower of South Padre. So back in 2008, this project gives us an extreme but telling example of lock-in. This project relied on an incomplete geotechnical data. So expansive clays beneath the mat foundation weren't fully characterized. And once the concrete was placed, those assumptions could not be changed. The result was differential settlement, which led to structural cracking and ultimately demolition before the project finished. This was a $75 million loss. This is a big reminder that better early stage coordination and validation, they're not about more cost and paperwork. They're about performance control and risk mitigation. So we want to move back in and take a look at this timeline again. So looking at the same sequence, but kind of looking at it in a different way. So managing these early stages differently means extending the same rigor that we bring to the pre-construction and extending it into the ground phase itself. In this visual, you can see that we net together project prep and site readiness. There are three key elements of this shift that we should focus on that will make the difference in closing the gaps. First is earlier expertise integration. That's bringing your geotech group, reinforcing, and ground partners in before the final design. Second is cross-discipline coordination. We're making sure site prep, geotechnical, and structural teams cross-validate the same ground reality. And third is checkpoint rigor. Treat the transition from site prep to foundation pour as a formal go, no-go milestone. Site prep serves as construction's final reality check. So these are not extra steps. They're about managing the same steps differently. And they are this is the difference between predictable performance and expensive surprises. So with that framework, Mike or Nick, any thoughts or questions?
Yeah, from an insurance and risk management standpoint, I think we're often asked, at what portion or what phase of a project should insurance and risk management be engaged, be involved? And truthfully, the answer to that is really in that planning and design stage, right? The earlier that your risk management group is aware of the project, the earlier they can be provided with documents and get those documents to your insurance intermediary, the better chance underwriting is going to have to do a thorough review of the project and provide your organization with the most comprehensive insurance policy out there for whatever phase of the project you're going through. These underwriting companies, I think everybody thinks about it as deals that are getting made on napkins at bars after hours. Not necessarily how it happens anymore, and it doesn't happen on the golf course anymore either. They really are turning into risk engineering firms with their own engineering group, running reports, doing thorough reviews of geotechnical documents, combing through those to truly understand the site conditions. They're doing thorough reviews of engineering sets and design sets to see that they're meeting market standards. Now they'll make certain recommendations here or there. They're not going to try to re-engineer a project, if you will, but they are taking all that into consideration when they're choosing to insure a project and what the terms and conditions, deductible structure, et cetera, will be for a project. So the earlier your risk management group and your insurance intermediary can be involved in that process, the better.
Great points.
Great.
Yes, the site prep and foundation, they rippled themselves several times throughout the construction phase as well.
Yep. No, thanks. I think bringing those stakeholders in earlier. I think it's a mindset shift in construction. A lot of times, I think that there's a thought that the competitive advantage maybe gets taken away whenever too many stakeholders are brought in too early. But the mind shift and the change from the focus on the initial price of the bid versus the performance and the risk mitigation that early in collaboration with stakeholders is really shifting from keeping those siloed to bringing them together as a network at the beginning of the project. So thanks for the feedback on that. With that, I'll turn it over to Mike, and he'll be able to share from some of his real experiences in the construction industry.
Thanks, Stephen. Yeah, so I'll talk a little bit about the effective planning, but also the effective execution. Planning starts at the top. Why at the top? Because you got to set the vision. The field crews aren't prepared to look 6, 8, 10, 12 months out in advance to understand where they're going to be. So setting a vision, understanding what that vision is, and then getting their buy-in, and then ultimately working through what that execution looks like, getting them on board. You got to have 100% buy-in from your team, the subcontractors, the foremen that are going to actually execute that work in the field to your vision, and bringing them forward so that they can execute flawlessly at the end of the day. You might wonder why this is important to the engineering team out there. Well, it's important to everybody. Site constraints, traffic patterns, access, work hours, they're important to the construction crews when they're going to execute. But understanding those parameters as designers when we're putting this on paper, when we're engineering the job itself, so that we have the access we need, we're not pigeonholed into a corner to try to build the work. The tighter the constraints, the more factors we've got to work through, the more expensive the job gets, or ultimately becomes unbuildable. So all those factors need to be taken into consideration, and the more opportunity you have to give the contractor the best framework early on in the project, the better that proposal will be, and the more factors that don't have to be considered in the project itself. E&S has become one of those big factors as we look to be more environmentally conscious in the construction side of things, but understanding your site. This may have been the best option the designer had in his hands, given the site constraints he was delivered, but putting a temporary sediment basin underneath a bunch of townhomes, not necessarily the greatest solution if he could have avoided it. At the end of the day, I don't know that I want to buy one of those houses if I could have avoided or I knew what was there. But if there was a way to use the permanent system, the permanent storm structures or storm basins in a manner to better suit the needs, would have been an opportunity. Looking at a different site, that's exactly what the engineer was able to do. On the left, you see the temporary sediment basin. On the right, the permanent storm pond and the ultimate build out of the system. So great opportunity to utilize something permanent for a temporary system and then ultimately build upon that later in the project. Site constraints are everything. Understanding that the tighter the constraints, as I mentioned earlier, make the project that much more complex. This is a difficult project. You don't even see it in the top of the screen, but there's an overhead utility that constrained the type of equipment, the access needs, and just overall impacted the project to a point where it was a bunch of specialty equipment, one way in, one way out, very difficult to build. Successfully executed, but it took an immense amount of planning and team buy-in to get there. Another one of those opportunities is as you get to the finishes, everybody's pushed to finish a job on time. The easy button is one person takes their turn, everybody gets in line, and behind that line, step by step by step to the finish line. But we don't have time like that in a project typically. So coordinating the dance, if you will, figuring out how teams can work their way around each other. Everybody's still productive. Everybody still gets the job done, but everybody's doing so at similar times or overlapping their operations such that they are each successful, but we're shrinking the overall presentation of the job. And as things have gotten busier in the construction industry, now we have these overlapping contracts. So here's a picture here. Seems pretty mundane, big open field. What may not come out in context is these are two different contracts, two different contractors with several subcontractors all working underneath themselves. So how do we do that working together? Well, contract language is one thing. You can say everybody needs to work together in the same sandbox, coordinate their work, but it really comes down to each of those teams having a vision, a want, and a desire, a commitment to each other to be successful as a team. So to Stephen's point earlier, foundation, planning on those things and moving forward. It's the same aspect in construction. Here's a 300-ton crane sitting on top of a wire wall, 40 foot tall. Well, that didn't happen overnight. It didn't happen with just the planning of the erection operation. That happened at the very bottom. We started the operation. We planned what we were going to do. We knew, generally speaking, what we were going to have to be at the top so that we could have a foundation set forward, be able to support that crane ultimately and set the girders that we needed. It took a lot of approvals. It doesn't happen yesterday. To get these approvals takes months and months and months. So knowing those approval steps, knowing how far out in front of yourselves you've got to get these steps in place can allow that project to continue to move forward successfully. Similar situation. Took 2 years to plan this one. Still got the railroad involved and other entities, but you don't just put a 440-ton crane, a foot away from a back wall willy-nilly. There takes a lot of buy-in and true engineering to prove that that is all capable and it passes the operation. Safety. Safety is the forefront of everything. We can't build our jobs without having safety at the front of mind. But thinking about safety, not just for the operation you're about to do or what's right now, right in front of us, but about that next person coming in line or the next operation that's about to take place. Planning for that step is important and ultimately will lead to success on the project. And then as you move forward to structures over major interstates, they seem pretty mundane, right? Now, get an MOT, set up a closure. This project, any other place, any other location, pretty simple. One crane pick, hours worth of work. Now, the crane's location had to be put in the middle of the road, had to be fully assembled, fully disassembled each shift, and for two picks that in reality could have been done any other day in 2 hours. Making the complex or the operation itself more complex, the structure had to fit between two sound wall existing posts. So, not too bad. The job was designed to be that way. Everything was supposed to fit. What we actually found was early survey to that foundation aspect. Early survey identified that those sound wall posts were slightly differently located than what the original survey and the contract documents showed. Because we were out in front of it, we were able to get with the owner, identify some slight geometric shifts, move the job accordingly without any impact to the overall project itself. Had that been located or identified later in the project, it would have been a major impact to the structure as well as the job's timeline. And then anybody that's in the Northern Virginia region, I'm sure they're well aware back in January, Big Beam Weekend. To take the 495 Interloop and shut it down or divert it to just the express lane, 6 lanes to 2, it's a major operation. It didn't happen overnight. It didn't happen without a lot of coordination, not just from the construction side of things, but to make sure that you get out in front of the public. You don't do some of these operations without major public involvement.
Well, sounds like Michael's having some technical difficulties. So I'm going to jump back into some of his slides and talk about, some of the things that we see from a risk management and kind of how that coordinates from a risk engineering side. So hopefully have him back here in just 1 minute. But So when we look at the temporary sediment basins versus the permanent pond, like I said before, these underwriting companies are now really looking at themselves as risk engineering firms. And one thing that you may not consider is like, well, what's going to be easier during the actual project, during the course of construction is, the sediment basin might be a little bit easier versus the permanent pond. But what happens post-construction when you have all these completed homes or completed townhomes that are sitting on, unstable soils? And what is that going to mean for their property insurance? And if there was a settlement loss of some sort, and by that, I don't mean the insurance claim, but if those houses started to settle over time, you could be looking at a significant general liability claim against the early pre-construction work that was done for the site work, for the foundations, etc. So it may be a claim that comes years after the project's completed and your firm has moved on to, dozens of other projects that could be hundreds of millions of dollars in losses. So again, things that would be considered from that overall risk management standpoint that may not factor into anything that you're doing day to day, but might factor into management's decisions as to how a project is designed and how it moves forward. When I look at, these slides, obviously some general liability exposure there. This is likely going over a creek of some sort, which presents significant environmental exposure. What we see when you have, gas and diesel on sites is if there are any spills of any sort, what are the containment factors that are in place to prevent a significant environmental hazard? Again, that could be hundreds of millions of dollars, if, likely tens of millions, but even could be more when you have spills that get into a water system or a water table of some sort. So again, it's coordination with not only, your EPC and general contractors, but all those subcontractors as well. When underwriting companies are looking at projects, they're not looking at the owner of the project. They're truly underwriting the EPC contractor, the general contractor, and the subcontractors that are being selected for that project. They're looking at, do we know anything about these subcontractors' loss history from other projects? So, sometimes it's not simply selecting the most cost-effective subcontractor that's in the best interest of the project, because you may be saving money on one hand and losing it on the other hand because of increased insurance costs. When I look at this project, I see, as Michael said, you've got what looks like one big project, but it's two general contractors. It's, like he said, dozens of subcontractors that are potentially working side by side. You could have a loss that occurs on one project site that emanates to the other. So it becomes a physical loss or damage on project A, and it's a general liability loss on project B. Right? So it's going to hit you on both sides. Same thing from an environmental standpoint, right? So this is, again, where, I'm sure the risk management people at your organizations are not the most exciting people. And I say this because I'm not the most exciting person to deal with. But these are the realities that we deal with day in and day out on these projects, and where that risk coordination, comes into play to make sure that, accidents are going to happen. What have we done to try to prevent those accidents from occurring from a site management and a site safety standpoint? And if that accident does occur, do we have all of the necessary coverages in place to respond? So, 80% of my job is not placing the coverage. It's not going out and, trying to secure new clients. It's reading contracts. It's contract negotiation to make sure that there is, adequate limits being carried by a general contractor or a subcontractor to satisfy an owner. Or if an owner-controlled insurance program is being put into place, do we have all the necessary excess limits there to satisfy the contracts for a municipality, a state, a lender? As we look at this project, You have the challenges of working over a railway. Whenever you have railroad involved, that requires a whole different set of coverage contracts that most contracting firms don't typically carry. So the railroads have been around forever. They have easements and setbacks that you need to be able to adhere to, and in some states it's 50 feet, and other states it's 100 feet. So knowing those requirements for what you need to satisfy that railroad contract is certainly something that you need to be speaking with your risk management group about. So.
Hey, Nick, as you've got a lot of experience in these different obstacles that come up in these different sites, and you've got, you spoke to some of what you think should be done better. Can you expand upon kind of what would be better in planning as far as stakeholders coming in, or what you see could be done better in the early stage planning? And then with your years in the business, have you seen, what are some of the shifts that you've seen from owners and projects when they take a different view and start to, maybe start going down the path that you would like to see them go? Are you seeing some of that change take place?
No, I'd say absolutely. Any owner contractor where risk management is being engaged probably like 6 to 9 months before project start is really going to occur results in the most beneficial and successful project starts, the most comprehensive coverage. And it's a way that is done in a tactical and strategic way to make sure that all the necessary coverages are in place when they need to be in place, and that everybody isn't kind of sprinting at the end. We are often brought in on projects where project start is 30 to 60 days away, and an owner says, well, we'd like to do an OSIP. Well, an owner-controlled insurance program typically takes a minimum of 90 days to put together. In a perfect world, you have 6 months to put it together. It allows for not only risk management and insurance intermediaries to wrap their heads around what's all occurring with the project, but it allows them to paint that appropriate picture to the underwriting market to create competition for the project, to drive the best terms and conditions, and get all of the necessary capacity. So I would say, again, that early engagement, and more importantly than even that, is like a comprehensive set of documentation that can be transferred to the insurance intermediaries in like a nice succinct package. It just makes it much easier for us as that insurance intermediary to tell the underwriting company, like, here's all of the documentation that you're going to need to review this project and make a risk engineering determination. So, well, I believe Michael's back. So I'd like to give him the opportunity to finish up on some of these slides. Michael, I think this is where we left off with you.
Yeah, I apologize for the technical difficulties. Thank you, Nick. Yeah, I mean, as we talk about the Big Beam weekend from earlier here in 2025, this didn't happen overnight. This planning occurred over many years. The 300-foot span across a third-level structure, you can see the crane sitting in the middle of the interloop. It took a lot of buy-in, a lot of planning just to get the owner level and the regulatory side of things to buy into the concept, not to mention as a general contractor or a dedicated subcontractor in this case, to get our subcontractors who are actually going to perform the work to buy in that this was conceptually possible as well. So big deal. And then as you look through the next slide, you see that this entire structure was completely assembled at the shop. The girders are so tall, they're 11 foot tall. They were shipped flat, had to be flipped on site. So you think about then the flipping on site, the crane stage location, the other operations that have to occur just to be prepared for a weekend like this. Yeah, so these are some success pictures here from that weekend's operation. Not only was the operation a huge success from the teamwork and everything that went on, folks in the field execute this so well that they actually beat the schedule by 4 hours. So a Friday night, it was supposed to be done before Monday morning rush hour throughout the entirety of the weekend, was completed, late Sunday night. And we assured that nobody headed to work on Monday morning even knew we were there. So huge success by everybody that was involved. After you have a successful operation, you need to look forward to what was successful, what maybe can we learn from that operation, what could we have done better. But that post-operation recap and learning opportunity is huge, especially for us self-performing contractors. Did we make money at it? Could we have done better at it? Where could we have improved the operation as a whole? What maybe did we overlook as just contractors, or what maybe would a little bit differently than planned? And then if you flip one more slide, ultimately
Michael,
we got a plan for the unexpected.
Yeah, Michael, if I may there too, right? And obviously, you talk about a weekend long project and the success there of being able to execute on that timeline. But one of the things that comes into play on longer projects, right, is if there are delays on a project, that means costs are going up, not only for, labor, but also you have to come back to your insurance company and tell them this project that we thought was going to take us 9 months actually ended up taking us 11 months, which means they had a greater exposure for those losses, whether it's a general liability loss, an environmental loss. And then you also tell them our $200 million project actually ended up being $225 million. Well, then they're going to charge you for that additional $25 million in exposure. So those cost overruns are not just mitigated to the actual operations on the project. You see them on the back end, and that can be the difference between profitability on a project and maybe not being profitable on a project.
Yeah, Nick, that's so true. And I think maybe a part of the puzzle that the people don't always understand or think about. And then ultimately planning for the unexpected. And I think, Nick, you can highlight more of that unexpected or risks that are out there that we all need to be planning for from the ground up.
Yeah, and I've tried to kind of sprinkle that in throughout the presentation because, again, nobody wants to sit through the insurance slides aspect of this, but that's really what we're there to do, is kind of think of those worst case scenario type situations. But as I said, our responsibilities really start early in that process of engaging with project management teams and the risk management groups at firms to understand the ins and outs of the project, right? Like, I haven't been on enough project sites to be able to speak intelligently about what it takes to put one of these projects all together from, soup to nuts. But what I have been able to do is successfully work to put together, contracts and then insurance policies to make sure that the owner, the general contractor, the subcontractors are all afforded the appropriate coverages given the exposures of the project, that municipalities who notoriously have very difficult terms and conditions that need to be met or requirements that need to be met, they are much more stringent than like a private owner would be for their requirements if you're doing a project for a private owner versus, again, a government entity or municipality of some sort. So our job is to kind of try to sit in the middle there and explain some of the realities of the global insurance marketplace to all the different stakeholders and decision makers that need to come together in order for one of these projects to be successfully executed, and try to find common ground where, again, appropriate amounts of coverage can be obtained at an affordable level so that especially these large infrastructure projects across the crumbling infrastructure in the United States can be addressed, and we don't have to keep kicking the can down the road on them years and years because of affordability. Our job, ultimately when it comes down to it, is not for insurance to get in the way. It's for it to, be there to dovetail with the contracts to make sure that the projects can get done, and ultimately, can hopefully get done within the budget that's been set by the owner and the contractor.
Yeah, Nick, I think there's a lot of your perspective that you're bringing to this conversation is very interesting. And when you talk about the earlier engagement of risk management from owners, what are some key elements there that you would encourage owners to do in order to improve their risk management? And we've talked about bringing stakeholders in earlier, but I don't want to put words in your mouth on that. But when you're encouraging owners to have that a lot earlier, risk mitigation or risk management, what is some other underlying enablers to that?
Yeah, I think getting their insurance intermediaries who are a bit of experts in the space. I think oftentimes, and I say this with all due respect to the risk managers that might be on this call or might hear this recording, is they're jacks of all trades, just like I'm a jack of all trades. It really helps to have the individuals who are designing these projects, who have done the engineering work, to be able to speak that language to the underwriting companies that are going to be insuring these projects. A lot of it gets lost in translation when it is, put into simple terms and risk manager is speaking to, insurance intermediary. If we can get the individuals who have actually, worked with the environmental reports, who have worked with the engineering firms on the design, or if you're doing in-house design, the in-house designer who says, we designed it this way because of these factors that are present on the site. This is what we're trying to accomplish. This is how we've mitigated the risk out of it through design. That is tremendous when it comes to presenting a project to the underwriting company, because they are saying, well, wait a second, the client has already thought about these things and put these plans into action without us having to tell them, have you thought about this? Have you thought about that? And what are you going to do to mitigate that?
No, thanks a lot. And Mike, just a question for you. When I was looking at, I'm very familiar with that project in Virginia, having spent some of my career there when that project was going on. So that complex setting of the bridge and the beams and all that, the big beam weekend, and you talked about you doing like a post-mortem on that and looking at things that could have maybe possibly done better or what was success. But some of what when you go to Shirley's website and you look at what you guys are focused on as a company, it's really a lot of this early stage planning and putting the true full plan together to remove risk from a project, and early planning, to result in the performance and the quality performance. So that's a significant project. Are there any kind of stories you could tell about the success of that early planning for that project and what did make it a success?
Stephen, that really comes down to having all the stakeholders available and at the table at the same time. When you bring everybody in a room, you can sit down and talk to each other candidly about concerns, their viewpoint, what makes it a success for them, and have those open dialogues very early. It makes it a lot more palatable to put together a plan that can either mitigate or alleviate as much as reasonably possible concerns. That weekend didn't happen overnight. It also came with exit points and strategies along the way. We ultimately had 12-hour check-ins between senior leadership so that we either knew we were on track or we knew we were going to, implement an exit point that was earlier than the complete finish. Fortunately, we didn't have to implement those, but we had those elements structured into the plan so that we all knew where we were. The communication could funnel back through our own agencies or independent contractors. So we knew what was in front of us. But it's that open and honest dialogue with all parties in the room that really makes these successful.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Those are the success stories we all want to talk about. I was thinking earlier when I talked about, I'm passionate about early stage construction, and why is that? My 20 years in the business from the more of a material supply side. If we talk about our ability and our success to deliver and our responsibility for a project and the lane of responsibility that we're delivering on, but the overall project is not successful, it's really, you want to go back and talk about how well we or you or somebody in their lane of responsibility did. But if the overall project's not successful, we're like, yeah, nobody wants to talk about that project. But if the overall project is successful and all those stakeholders came together and it's a win-win, those are the ones that we really want to share the story about. So it's the partnership versus the lane of responsibility. It's the network versus the siloed approach. So thanks a lot. Nick, anything else?
No, nothing further from me. I think it makes sense to maybe go to the Q&A session.
Okay. All right. Yeah. So from today's conversation, just sharing with the audience, this is the QAs for our LinkedIn, or QR codes, for each of the individuals that presented. So if you want to reach out, touch base with us, ask us questions individually, that's there for you. And then if you want to continue the conversation on early stage construction, there's another QR code there. There's articles that are continually released on early stage construction where we take even a deeper dive and get a little bit more detail on it. So for continuing the conversation, that's available for the audience as well. So with that, Scott, I'll turn it back over to you.
Great. Thank you, Stephen, Mike, and Nick. This was really a great conversation. I want to remind our viewers that if you have questions, now would be a good time to send them in so I can field them to our panelists. But before we do address those questions that have come in through the webinar so far, I'd like to remind our viewers that we'd love their feedback. So please take a few moments to complete our survey, which you'll see on the screen now, or you'll be redirected at the end of the program. So actually, I had a couple of questions that occurred to me as I was listening to your presentation, gentlemen. The first one is, treating site to foundation handoff as a formal go, no-go checkpoint makes sense. But what specific data or verification steps should be non-negotiable before approving that transition? And what criteria for those stages should define readiness and accountability?
Yeah, good question. I think a lot of things come to mind on that one. Open it up to Mike or Nick if you've got thoughts on it, or got a couple of thoughts on it myself. But
Yeah, I'd say go right ahead, Stephen.
Okay. Yeah, so your question's on the go, no-go milestone of site prep. And what specific, I think you asked what specific data needs to be verified before we actually, what are some of those milestones or phased approvals
exactly
that would take place before we take it? So, we've seen a lot of, the example of the failure was the geotechnical, report was flawed. So really the verified geotechnical reports, lab tested, cross-validated. So third-party validation of really confirming what the soil condition is to the best of the ability before entering. I think having that as a milestone, that cross-validation, third-party checkoff has been done to validate the geotechnical report.
Yeah, and a risk management check and balance there too is that oftentimes underwriting companies require that the general contractors and the engineers sign off on that they'll adhere to the recommendations from the geotechnical reports.
Thank you. Another question I had was, given how pivotal the earliest construction stages are, what skill gaps or training priorities do you see emerging for engineers, estimators, or field supervisors working in this part of the project?
Any thoughts on that, Mike?
Yeah, it's an interesting, thought. And as you look forward, we have so much of our industry that is either getting close to or starting to enter that next phase of life. And we're losing some of the I built, I knew, I understood, and the quick decision makers. Putting forward that next generation, starting to get them wanting to come into the industry, whether that's in the industry from an engineer, from, the client support side of things or the owner side of things, or even for that matter in the builders, the craft professionals that are in the field. We can't lose those that are ultimately going to put this work in place. And we need to excite that next generation, those middle schoolers, high schoolers, or into college age, to want to be a part of what makes the next generation put some great infrastructure in place.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I was going to say just the graying out of the industry, and we see it, in my industry as well, right? But that's, I think, the biggest concern.
Yeah, I think also, so the gap in training on people, I think, is the question. So, also I've mentioned this before on the call, is that we work in our silos of responsibility. And I think even within companies, we have our own silos within companies. So collaborative planning skills, training of collaborative planning skills, coordinating cross-discipline, and how we network together different disciplines and put a common plan in place. I think there's some skill set gaps that exist in the workforce.
Very good. A viewer's asking, how much change did you see in the crane load for those crawlers from initial planning to final execution?
So those cranes that you saw in all of the different examples or projects that I had up there, the loads don't change wildly from initial concept to final concept or final execution. Because at the end of the day, we should be fairly conservative, and then we're also engineering, some sort of load transfer platform, whether that's crane mats or some other load transferring device. So we can get pressures down into something that can be pre-engineered, understood, and work through at an early stage.
Thank you. I think this viewer has a little bit of a complaint, but the question is, why are all the quantities quoted in imperial? We converted to the metric system over 50 years ago.
Steven, your thoughts?
And that question's in regards to, is it to one of your slides, Mike, or?
No, I don't think so. Yeah, I mean,
is that just
that's
just a general question in the construction industry?
I believe so. I didn't realize it at the moment, but I think so.
Yeah. I think it's a good question. I don't think we have a solid answer for that one. I think it's probably a question in the majority of the industry's mind.
Another question from a viewer. Are geotechnical risks still the greatest risks on construction projects?
Hey, that's a great question. We did highlight the pivot points. And when we're saying that the geotechnical soil conditions, are really the pivot point, the last chance of validation before we start pouring concrete, that's where it really puts the focus on the soil conditions, because, as the earthwork begins and as foundation work begins, rebar, concrete, that's when mobilization happens. That's when there's a big head count on the job site. That's when your daily costs go up significantly. So I think we definitely highlighted that as a pivot point of where, if we have contingency plans in place going into it, because we're not going to be perfect on getting everything right in the office, but we're going to get better at it. But when you go in and you're having those contingency plans where you can adjust quickly, and not just be in a catch up, cover up, spiraling situation where you can offset that. So with that being said, yeah, it's been highlighted as a very high risk pivot point in construction process. I think I kick that one over to Nick.
Yeah. I mean, just quickly, it's when typically course of construction or builder's risk coverage is triggered as an effective date, is when permanent foundational work, and I'm using that term very broadly, is initiated. You can move a whole lot of dirt because dirt doesn't have value to it in the course of construction world. But as soon as you start putting any infrastructure of any sort in place, that is when, builder's risk coverage is typically, and I would say that means 75 to 85% of the time, is put into effect. Because if you're not covering that aspect of the work and the loss, a physical loss or damage is deemed to be a resultant from that work, you put yourself at jeopardy for an uncovered loss.
Thank you. Another viewer is asking, what about the risk with permitting processes, environmental and archaeological, for example?
Yeah, I saw that question come in, and it's great because the group, Mike and Nick and myself, were talking about possible questions, and kind of one of them was, the future of early stage. What does it look like in 5 years? What can drive differences? And obviously AI comes to mind and new digital platforms, but automated permitting and government approvals came up when in our minds. So definitely a risk with the time. I'm assuming that question's about the time it takes for permitting and the risk associated with that. So yeah, I think there's room for improvement there. Definitely something that I think in the future needs to be improved. How it gets improved, I'm not as familiar with the permitting process. Just wanted to let the audience know that did come up on future improvements. So I'll kick that over to Mike, being in the field and dealing with permitting. Some thoughts on that.
Yes, it's certainly a huge concern, especially in the light of what we're in as a country right now in the middle of. So having a way, hopefully someday in the future, where some of those processes can be automated or through some AI-driven platform would be wonderful. Where we're at and how long it'll take to get there, I'm not quite sure. But yeah, it's a challenge, and one that none of us as contractors can ultimately control.
Another question is, traditional procurement often separates design and construction. What changes, contract language, delivery models, or incentive structures, would most help align accountability for early stage outcomes?
I think I got that question. I'm just thinking through what you just said. So on procurement and accountability is how you started it. Can you just speak through that one more time?
Yeah, yes. So traditional procurement often separates design and construction. But what changes in areas like contract language or delivery models or incentive structures would best help align accountability for early stage outcomes?
Gotcha. Yep. Any thoughts, Mike or Nick?
So from my perspective, Stephen, I think this comes, more from just how one views the industry. Despite the contract type or how it might be executed in a contract itself, coming to the table with good thought, a solution-driven mindset in any delivery model can deliver good outcomes for the owner at the end of the day and the contractor for that matter. So there's ways to improve that, whether it's partnering or having other work sessions where both the contractor and the designer and or the owner can all become more aligned with each other and work more collaboratively in any platform.
Yeah. Yeah. I think I picked up there like the separation of design from construction and I think something about incentives and accountability. So I think it speaks to what we were talking about, netting more of the earthwork and the grounds professionals into that pre-con and netting more of the stakeholders together, and then getting that common collaborative phased approach, setting some milestones early on before the concrete's poured. Those checkbox milestones that have to be accomplished, and with that can be some performance incentives, hitting those milestones early before you get into that lock-in effect that we were talking about.
Thank you. We have just a couple of minutes for one more question. And here it comes. When it comes to sustainability and resilience goals, how much of a project's long-term performance is really set during early stage construction? And what practices make the biggest difference?
Well, I know the answer to the how much is set because that's something we kind of researching in early stage construction. So yes, a significant portion is set. Up to 60 to 70% of the life cycle is locked in early stage construction.
Anything more to add before we close? Okay.
I think I was to say, 60 to 70% of that's locked in, but that initial portion might be 10% of the overall project. And so within that 10% of the project, the team, that's where really we can set the tone for the success of the project because 60 or 70% is locked into that first 10% of the project timeline. And if you get that success right, nobody wants to be, I spoke to it earlier about, you don't want to be talking about your success in the lane that you're responsible for. You want to be talking about that success of the entire project. And everybody in the construction industry that's on this call will know, when a project is trying to catch up because of delays or because of, rework that had to be done, then everybody's behind the 8 ball and you're just chasing that train to the end of the project. So 60 to 70% locked in early. And, the work that's done on that 10% of the timeline early can make all the difference in the success of the entire project.
Yeah, I would say a lot of our extensions are around, design changes. I mean, there's always challenges with permits, challenges with equipment, but there's often unforeseen circumstances, design changes kind of midterm on a project. And as somebody, again, who does not spend a ton of time on project sites, how does that happen? And I think, to Stephen's point, to Michael's point, there are practices and processes in place to try to mitigate that as much as possible, and just continuing to try to work towards those.
Great. Well, that's all the time we have for questions today. Please join me again in thanking our presenters, Stephen Penny, Michael Trabucco, and Nick Cott, as well as today's sponsor, CMC. If you have any additional questions or comments, please don't hesitate to click the Email Us button on your console, and we'll share those with our presenters so they can respond to you directly. If you didn't have a chance to fill it out earlier, you will be redirected shortly to our post-event survey, and we look forward to hearing from you about how we can make our programs work better for you. Please visit enr.com/webinars for the archive of this presentation to share with your colleagues, as well as information about our upcoming events. We hope that you found today's presentation to be a good investment of your time. Thank you again for joining us and have a great day.